Chichester, and we're going to be having a couple of presentations this afternoon. One, we're going to hear from some of the people that have been involved in the Bureau of Justice Assistance Drug Court Enhancement Grant that Maine has, and hearing about their experiences and the takeaways that they have in a global sense. There will be an evaluation that will be coming out from Hornby Zellos that will give more specific information, but wanted to have an opportunity to share some of the insights that have been gathered through this experience with the drug court. And following that, in about a half hour, we're going to turn the presentation over to Alyssa Benedict, who is going to be talking about trauma-informed practices in drug courts. She's a national expert, and I will introduce her in just a few minutes. Before we get started, there's just a couple of housekeeping items that I'd like to share with everyone. One, just to remind people that we are planning on trying to mute the presentation until we open it up for Q&A. However, if you're on a telephone and you're not in front of a screen, it may mean that you will need to mute your phone separately. So that's always helpful so we don't get feedback or outside noise during these webinars. And then at the end of the presentation, we are going to be giving some continuing education credits for those of you who are on the line. So following the presentation, we will send you out a link for online evaluation. And once those evaluations come back to us, we'll be sending out certificates to you. If there is a problem, you don't receive a link or don't receive a certificate, you can email us at ccsme@ccsme.org. So I think those are the housekeeping items. So we actually have Elizabeth Simoni, who is the Executive Director of Maine Pretrial Services, as well as Darcy Wilcox, who is the Case Management Director for Maine Pretrial Services and who oversees the drug court managers who were involved in this project. And they are going to walk us through some of their reflections on this. Elizabeth, Darcy, I'm going to be showing the slides, so just tell me when you would like me to advance to the next slide.
Okay, that sounds great. This is Elizabeth Simoni speaking. Good afternoon. We're going to start off with a little bit of general information about the drug courts in Maine. So our first slide shows a map, slide 2, that reflects where the drug courts are located in Maine. And I don't see it advancing on my computer, but
you don't see it? Okay. Let's see.
There you go. Thank you.
Okay.
So there are 5 adult drug treatment courts in Maine. Those are located in York County, Cumberland County, Androscoggin County, Hancock County, Penobscot County, and Washington County. The Penobscot County Court is a small court that accepts people from the Penobscot County area, but they are actually serviced for court and for treatment over in Hancock County. There are 3 family treatment drug courts in Maine, and those are in Androscoggin County, Kennebec County, and Penobscot County. And then finally there is 1 co-occurring disorders and veterans court, and that's located in Kennebec County, but it accepts participants from around the entire state. So you have 9 courts that are currently servicing the whole county, if you look at the whole county, the whole state, if you look at the co-occurring model, but they're situated in 7 counties in Maine. On the next slide, we'll just quickly review the mission of the adult drug courts, and we're focusing on that right now because it is slightly different than the other courts. The mission of the adult court is to stop criminal activity that is related to the abuse of alcohol and other drugs, to hold adult criminal defendants and offenders accountable, and to increase the likelihood of successful rehabilitation of participants through intensive judicial supervision, case management, and specialized treatment for substance use disorders and other disorders. The next slide looks at the mission of the Co-Occurring Disorders Court, and that is slightly different in that it is to support the recovery of defendants from drug and alcohol abuse and psychiatric disorders, to reduce the risk of recidivism, enhance public safety, and to improve the quality of life for defendants and their families through early, continuous, and intensive judicially supervised integrated treatment and other appropriate rehabilitation services. The next slide focuses on the veterans track. The Co-Occurring Disorders Court started first 10 years ago, and then in 2011, under the leadership of Justice Nancy Mills, a special veterans track was created. This track accepts veterans from any era, whether or not they were deployed to combat theater, and has served folks that served in Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, etc. Most of the veterans have no history of criminal behavior or co-occurring disorders prior to their service. This court was created in recognition that the needs of veterans who present with substance abuse and mental health disorders contribute to their current criminal conduct, and the factors that are taken into account when they become involved in the criminal justice system help us achieve better outcomes with these vets than those that would result from traditional case processing and incarceration. The next slide talks a little bit about the model that we use for these problem-solving courts in Maine. In Maine, it's a post-plea or post-adjudication court, and that just means someone has to plead guilty to enter the court, so they're accepting responsibility. And they are served by a multidisciplinary team. The team includes representatives such as judges, prosecutors, defense counsel, case management, substance abuse treatment specialists, probation officers, law enforcement officials, corrections personnel, educational and vocational experts, and mental health workers. Each team has its own constellation representing those different disciplines. The cases involve high-risk offenders who abuse substances, and the case processing includes comprehensive supervision, drug testing, treatment services, and immediate incentives and sanctions to behavior. The admission to the court is in exchange for the guilty plea, and the successful completion could result in a reduced sentence, and termination from the program could result in a standard sentence that's agreed upon prior to admission. The next slide reviews the target population for these courts. These courts serve individuals who are high risk to reoffend, and this is based on objective risk and need assessments. We use a tool in Maine that's been validated nationally and also validated specifically in Maine. It's called LSIR, and it stands for the Level of Service Inventory Revised. And we also use SV, which is the tool in the short version. So we screen folks to see if they are high risk, high need, and the high risk is to reoffend. The high need is for the substance abuse treatment, and that is based on comprehensive treatment assessments using the ASAM criteria. The next slide looks at the national model, and Maine strives to work within that national model. The national model has been established by the National Association of Drug Court Professionals and other players in the national justice field. They recognize 10 key components that are the best practice standards for adult drug courts. Number one, as we just said, they serve a high-risk, high-need population. Number two, they use a non-adversarial approach by employing a multidisciplinary team to process these cases. There's frequent judicial monitoring, and in Maine, that's typically once a week or at minimum every 2 weeks. Early identification of participants, specialized case management and treatment services, gold standard drug and alcohol testing, and that means frequent, random, and observed testing, and then behavior modification management. In an earlier slide, we talked briefly about a framework of graduated sanctions and incentives to modify behavior. Finally, coordinated strategy among system partners to increase the effectiveness of these courts. On the next slide, we're going to look at areas from years ago when this grant was initially written where improvement was identified as a need for these courts. These recommendations come from the 2010 statewide adult drug court evaluation. So this is not a current snapshot. This is what was happening in 2010, which prompted us to apply for an enhancement grant, which is part of this review today. First of all, it was determined that we needed to reduce the time from referral to admission. This is consistent with those national standards. You want to have quick and ready access to these courts. The standard that was set in Maine was 30 days, and we were exceeding that statewide. Secondly, we wanted to decrease the use of jail as a sanction and implement a system of graduated sanctions. What this means is, instead of a knee-jerk reaction, if someone violated a condition and it wasn't a matter affecting public safety that was dangerous to the community, what other behavior modification or sanction can we implement so that that person is not just returned to jail every time? So we had to work on that. We also wanted to increase the number of drug tests to an average of 2 per week. We were close, but we weren't at 2 per week, and we now exceed that. So we'll talk about that a little later. We also wanted to broaden the scope of services available to women so that we were a gender-responsive court system. And finally, increase the diligence in tracking and entering data on ancillary services that drug court participants are referred to or receive. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Darcy Wilcox to talk about the grant. I'm not sure if Darcy's having a hard time coming on. Kate, are you still on the line?
Darcy, you need to unmute yourself.
And if she's unable to, I'll go through these slides as well, Kate.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm able to mute myself.
It's up at the top of your controls there. There's a green microphone, and you just click it. It should unmute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Thank you. I'm sorry. I apologize. So we were the beneficiaries of a drug court discretionary grant. In 2011, we applied and we received $1.5 million to apply to our statewide drug court program in the adult system. Part of this application for the grant included many different aspects that Elizabeth had talked about in terms of looking at some of the points of concern from the 2010 evaluation that we had. But our overall goal was to increase enrollment, and we wanted to do this by enhancing case management resources, adhering to the 10 key components by providing technical assistance and training to the teams, both as a larger group along with doing individual site training. We also wanted to bring different types of models, some treatment and cognitive behavioral treatment models, seeking safety, MRT, moral recognition therapy, and thinking for change. And we also wanted to have the benefit of another external evaluation. and that included some process and outcome measures through a data collection process done by the case managers. And so through our time working on the grant, what we have found, and this is mostly anecdotal, as Kate had mentioned earlier on in the webinar, we have not had the full benefit of a completed final evaluation, but we hope to receive that soon. But it is our experience and our observation that our referral and capacity did increase across the board, although not as significantly as we would have hoped. There has been progress in widening the range of clients who have high needs being accepted into the court, and we have increased referrals from defense attorneys by clarifying and training on a referral process across all the sites. The time frame from referrals to admission, however, is still a significant issue for some of the courts. As Elizabeth had mentioned, the national benchmark is 30 days, but Maine courts do struggle with meeting this benchmark. Our 2010 to 2012 data showed that there was only 22% of cases statewide in the drug courts that fell within 30 days or less as an average of getting into the court, and almost half of the cases that drug courts processed fell within the 31 to 89 day range. And one team had improved their process by using a NIATIC process improvement model, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But it was through that decrease of process time that we actually saw much more referrals come to the drug court, and in turn increased our capacity. Policy and procedures were also updated with the help of Form B. Zeller Associates. We were able to highlight the use of rewards and sanctions, and also try to standardize our admission process. We also used data, and that was done through using the DTICS information system. DTICS is a case management information system that is housed by the state and SAMS, and case managers are responsible for entering that information, and treatment and judges also have access. Technical assistance and training was provided to the teams, and that did improve quality, and we think also played a part in increasing the census. As I mentioned before, we did training in 3 clinical treatment models that was delivered to all of the providers who work in the drug court. There was also a Maine Specialty Docket Summit that really gave opportunity for some team building and more additional education in terms of drug court best practices. We also had the benefit of rolling out an innovative housing model in Hancock County. This is a transitional housing program for drug court clients. And case management was enhanced by improving the quality of service. We had an opportunity to bring on board a full-time case management supervisor, and the supervisor was able to run the circuit and assist case managers and teams with their day-to-day work. And so the next slide really gives a snapshot of the NIATIC process improvement model that we use to help increase our process in terms of efficiencies. And this is just a quick flow chart of how we did that. We took all of the tasks assigned to the case manager and treatment, as well as the team in terms of their decision-making process. And we looked at each point in that process and the time it took for that process to unfold. And we were able to target areas of needed improvement. And this ultimately gave us the opportunity to identify those problem areas and to target them in a way that would decrease our admission process time. And so this example was the Hancock County Treatment Drug Court. They were able to reduce their admissions process from 71 days down to 41 days on average. So that was quite a success for them. And so part of those changes included the case manager going to the jail and doing an intake and one visit. For those who are familiar with the drug court process, an intake can be a long process, and so we looked at reducing the amount of information that we were gathering at the first visit, but also completing all of the tasks associated with a new referral at one visit, and that helped decrease the time folks were in a pending process. The case manager also visited the jail on a more frequent basis, and this allowed to get updates from the defendant who was seeking to get into the drug court. It also gave opportunity for the case manager to gather more information. And same-day letter of notification to an attorney after the team makes an admission decision was critical. This allowed for attorneys to get working on plea agreements a lot sooner than it was occurring in the past, and that ultimately led to admission hearings being scheduled fairly quickly after a decision was made from a team. And pre-agreement boilerplate language and date set for induction occurred also on the same decision day that the team when the team met, and this again allowed for greater efficiencies in terms of scheduling those admission hearings. And so lessons learned, I'm going to turn this over to Elizabeth to talk about sort of the overarching grant aims that we started with in terms of lessons learned.
So one of the interesting opportunities that this grant presented for the state of Maine through substance abuse and mental health and the judicial branch partnership was that it was, quote unquote, an opportunity to enhance anything you wanted to enhance about any area of your court or court system. In my language, it was almost a free-for-all opportunity. These types of solicitations do not come out frequently. I've never seen one in my career, and this was an opportunity to write a request that says, here's what we're doing in Maine, and here's how we'd like to enhance it. And so it created, in our minds, in writing this grant, between the court and SAMS, an opportunity to look at every site individually. And one of the lessons that we learned was each site has strengths and each site has some need areas. And so what came out in the writing of this was almost like a beautiful patchwork quilt. There were opportunities and needs in each of the counties. So for instance, we worked on law enforcement in Washington County. The county is so huge geographically that we knew we needed help. We wanted to fund law enforcement to go out and assist with bail checks and random search and testing. Well, we didn't need that in the southern part of Maine. We knew we needed housing opportunities in Hancock. They were struggling mightily with people failing out of their courts because they didn't have adequate and appropriate housing. So this patchwork quilt was created. And I would say that one of the lessons learned that we've talked about around the multidisciplinary leadership table is you've got all these different courts. They're led by different judges. They have different practitioners on the team. And so there isn't a consistent goal under this grant. Again, it's the patchwork quilt. What are you working on in your county? So it was difficult to manage the different goals as applied to each of the courts. I think if we had one set idea, such as let's reduce time in all courts, that would have been easier to focus on. But we were really ambitious, and it was a large financial award, so we went for it and created the quilt. Darcy?
We learned Another lesson that we had learned was more technical support could have been provided directly to the teams and the stakeholders to address barriers, support team building, and cross-team pollination and consistency. As Elizabeth alluded to, each team really had their successes, but also had their challenges. And so that presented a challenge to all of us to provide the support necessary to tackle some of those challenges. So I think if we were to take on an effort such as this in the future, we definitely want to have an eye more towards that, that technical support provided to each team. And then training needs to be tied to implementation support. As we talked about earlier, we had brought 3 distinct treatment models to the drug courts in hopes that we could expand some of the treatment options for the clientele. However, main drug courts, the adult drug treatment courts, were using the DFAT model, and so we were really challenged, obviously, in trying to bring forth 3 brand new models for folks to utilize. Some of the courts, though, and some of the treatment providers did, though, use some of the models like Seeking Safety with success. Another lesson learned was continual and ongoing evaluation feedback. It was really critical for us to have a researcher on board with this grant. That gave us the opportunity to constantly discuss data and use data to drive some of the decisions that we were making. But we know that making data-driven decisions is critical to tackling some of your challenges. So we definitely would give more attention to that area, especially when it comes to giving teams their own site-specific data. The next lesson learned was case management enhancement, although beneficial for quality by themselves, don't enhance court capacity. So part of this grant, we at Case Management had hired what we consider drug testers, and although that was successful in its own way, allowing more time for case managers to be with clients and perform case management duties, it did not directly affect capacity. The next lesson learned, collaborative community models with law enforcement, housing entities, and rural communities does work. We, as Elizabeth had mentioned, had a partnership with the Washington County Sheriff's Department. This allowed for assistance in house checks, home visits, after hours supervision of our clientele, and that was quite successful from this grant. And then also, as we had mentioned earlier, we had the benefit of starting a new innovative housing program in Ellsworth, which is about to launch in the next few weeks. And so what you're seeing in front of you is an example of some court-specific data sheets. This was given to all of the court sites through this grant at one time or another. And this is a very detailed data sheet provided by Hornby Zeller and Jen Battis, who is our evaluator. And as you can see, this is mostly about process data. It runs the range in terms of our referral process. And this is the type of information that we would like to be giving drug court teams on a regular basis. So it's very helpful. And so some of the challenges that we've had is the upfront time is still used by some of the courts, and you have some 2013 data here where 30 of the 77 clients active during 2013 were required to serve jail time prior to their admission into drug court. From the case management perspective, on time is really difficult to get away from, particularly in mandatory minimum sentences. And it is more or less a legislative issue. And so it's something that is out of our hands in terms of day-to-day operation in drug court. But there is also opportunity for some workarounds. Prosecutors can alter charges, and they have done this if appropriate in the drug court. But the one takeaway that I would like to give all of you is that drug court is a rigorous program, and the process itself holds people accountable through rewards and sanctions and judicial monitoring. And so, so even though we still have to use upfront time in Maine, drug court is a tough enough program for people in the system to utilize as an appropriate alternative sentence. The next challenge that we had was a continued bias against medication-assisted treatment in some courts. And this is strictly for the adult drug treatment courts. In our family drug treatment courts, there is no bias. Medication-assisted treatment is utilized effectively in all of the 3 family treatment drug courts. And from a case management perspective, we know that medication-assisted treatment is a best practice in the addiction field. However, there has been concerns from teams regarding diversion and abuse of medication-assisted treatment. But one takeaway from this webinar is that some of the adult drug treatment courts are effectively using Vivitrol and naltrexone as a way to complement cognitive behavioral treatment with success. Another challenge is ongoing team building and training is needed as team members change. Recently, SAMS hosted an excellent training through NDCI and NADCT. These are the National Organizations for Drug Court. And they are a great resource for drug court training. At Case Management here at Maine Pretrial, we utilize NDCI's online drug court training program. And so we hope in the future that new team members coming on to drug court teams will utilize this online resource. It's free and it's available to anybody who wants to sign up. Another challenge is sustaining positions that were effective when grant funds end. This definitely has been a challenge for us. However, with help from SAMS, we've been able to sustain most of the positions in the grant, which is amazing. Those positions include case managers as well as case manager supervisors. However, sustaining positions that are developed in grants is always a concern for folks. And this time around, we were lucky enough to have the benefit of being able to do that. And so Maine is not unique in some of these challenges. Being a partner or grantee with BJA has allowed for us to be able to know and understand who the other grantees are. And so we often get feedback with our participation on the grant. And these are some of the challenges that are happening nationwide. And so low number of referrals related to a lack of systematic procedures for early screening, downgrading of offenses and sentence exposure, internal disagreements over criteria for admission. The next is frequent personnel turnover for a variety of reasons, including judges and prosecutors. And we definitely have experienced that in Maine. Lack of housing and transportation, that is also something that we are challenged with in Maine. Inability to collect the data needed to manage, evaluate, and promote the program. Again, through our DTIC system, we are able to do these things, so that is a great benefit to us. Delays in program entry, often the result of bureaucratic requirements. Well, we have those challenges too, but through the NIATIC process improvement, we were able to correct some of those concerns. Implementing random drug testing, we strive to provide gold standard drug testing there. Locating resources to support medication-assisted treatment. Building, maintaining relationships with critical agencies, both referral and services. team collaboration, information sharing, inability of participants to pay required program fees, coordination between the VA and community services, and need for training at all levels on the drug court model, addiction, and team relationships.
So that's concluding our part of the presentation for today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elizabeth and Dorsey, for giving us kind of a walkthrough of the drug courts and some of your experiences and ongoing challenges that, as you pointed out, are not necessarily unique, but it sounds like there's been a variety of opportunities to learn and to address some of those during the grant period of time. So thank you. So at this point, I am going to turn this over to Alyssa Benedict. She is the founder and executive director of the CORE Associates, and she provides a lot of training and technical assistance and assessment, development, implementation, and evaluation of gender-specific and trauma-informed services and interventions. She's a federal partner currently with the National Resource Center for Justice-Involved Women. It has been a national consultant for the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, as well as the National Institute of Corrections. And she's served as a consultant faculty member for various offender initiatives, including one that I think Maine was involved in, which was NIC, Supervising Women Offenders in the Community, and the Women Offender Case Management Model. So she is definitely an expert, and I will turn this over to her to share some of her thoughts around trauma-informed services in the drug courts.
Okay, I'm just going to get my screen ready. Can you see my screen okay?
Yes, we can. It looks good.
Okay. Just have to mute something. Okay, so you can still hear me? Yes, okay. So I am so excited to be joining this webinar, and it was such a pleasure to hear about all of these thoughtful steps Maine is taking to really enhance drug court practices and processes. And I enjoyed the discussion in particular because any consideration of the structural and organizational components of a correctional intervention, in this case drug courts, provides a really, really important backdrop for a discussion of trauma and trauma-informed practices. And the reason for that is that the components that everyone so eloquently described and thoughtfully analyzed in terms of their strengths and areas for improvement, all of these components are so essential. And the exciting thing about what we're learning about trauma is that how we implement these different processes and how we go about selecting and implementing certain components really matters. And there's a way to do the work that's required as part of a drug court intervention in a way that's so attuned to trauma within all of the components, within all of the things that we do. For instance, you know, someone mentioned the use of a validated risk need tool, and I heard someone mention seeking safety as an intervention that's being used, and all of these thoughtful implementations are wonderful. But when we layer on this discussion of trauma, we actually will find, and I hope you realize by the end of this presentation, that you get a lot more out of these various components, be it a risk need tool implementation, groups, processes, how you go about testing, encouraging folks to actually show up, to be engaged with the community, how all of these actually are much more effective when we layer in a deep understanding of what trauma-informed practices are, what they look like, and if we actually can collaborate to implement them consistently across these different components. So it's just I'm actually glad that the piece on these components of drug courts came first, so that I can now bring us into a discussion of trauma and how implementing trauma-informed practices at all levels makes such a difference. So I'm going to go ahead and just give a quick summary of what I hope to cover today. So I thought it would be really helpful to just take some time to understand what trauma is and how it impacts individuals. And what I hope you'll enjoy about this section is that some of you may have noticed that trauma-informed practices is a buzz phrase nationally, particularly in corrections, and that's important. It's important that we're considering trauma. I'm not sure that people are always understanding what trauma really is and how significant and pervasive its impact is, not only on survivors, but on their families and communities, and on us as corrections professionals working day to day in our unique environments. Then I'd like to describe what the principles of trauma-informed practice are, and some of the evidence-based and best practice techniques that we can use for working with survivors, be it males or females. And I'll make sure to weave in a discussion of what it means to be gender responsive. As I say to a lot of the folks that I train, it's not enough to just focus on trauma, but we have to also be attentive to gender-specific reactions and needs, as well as those that are culturally specific. And then we'll talk about ways to create safe community corrections environments. And I hope to really make the case that, again, it's while curricula and assessment tools and various components are very important, there are so many ways to bring trauma-informed care to life as part of even our interpersonal interactions with the offenders that we work with, how a court proceeding is unfolding, how we walk with someone into a courtroom and prepare them for that, how we provide services, the conversations that we have. So there's lots of different ways that we can do this, and we'll talk about as many as we can in the time that we have today. So what is trauma? It's really important to make this distinction between the event that is considered to be traumatic and then the experience of trauma itself. And we'll talk a bit about what the events are, but we'll spend most of our time talking about what the impact is, what the experience is from the perspective of the person that has lived through these various traumatic events. What we know from the DSM and studies decades now of understanding of trauma is that traumatic events, and we'll talk about what those constitute, but they really involve a situation where someone experiences intense fear, helplessness, or horror. Sometimes their life is at risk, or there's a perception that their life is at risk, and then there is a whole slew of responses that person may experience that are really linked to changes in the brain that are helping them to respond to the overwhelm of that event. We'll talk about that more too. So we're going to be talking not just about what I think is common in the field, the psychological impacts of trauma, such as feeling like damaged goods, depression, anxiety, and all of those are important, but the new research that is really transforming what we mean by trauma-informed is suggesting that trauma really impacts the brain-body. So when we talk about neurophysiological impacts, we're talking about neuro, meaning what's happening in the brain, physiological, which means obviously what's happening in the body, and we're going to look at the whole person's response to that event and how they're coping, not just psychologically, but what's happening in their bodies as they're moving through the world, trying to complete a range of tasks that we're asking them to complete in order to fully transition, back into society, not under supervision by a court system, and be functioning and successful. The other thing I like to really describe around trauma is that we really sometimes think when we talk about traumatic events that they're singular, and we know that there are cases where someone has one primary event that comes to mind that was extremely disruptive or disturbing. But more often than not, the clients that we're working with in corrections, behavioral health and mental health, have had a series of traumatic events that they've been exposed to in their lives. And even if there's one or two events that they may highlight as particularly dominant, we know that there's been multiple traumas associated with that one event. For instance, the context in which that traumatic event was experienced may be filled with various related traumas. For instance, being told not to tell anyone, being threatened, not being believed, or just the silence and the experience of not being able to share or disclose what one has experienced with another human being. That silence in itself can be traumatic, so I wanted to call our attention to that, and this has a lasting impact. So I really like this SAMHSA definition because it really gets at the fact that it may be an event or a series of events, and it's, again, a very lasting impact at all levels: physical, social, emotional, spiritual, etc. The other thing I wanted to mention by way of introduction here is that if we had multiple days together, we could talk entirely for a day at least just about gender-specific responses and exposures and culture-specific responses and exposures. So I just want to acknowledge that when we are considering trauma, there's various subgroups that may have differential exposure to specific traumas, and then there may be different responses based on their various identities. And when I say culture here, whenever I reference culture, I don't limit that to ethnicity, but various dimensions of diversity, ability, sexual orientation, spiritual orientation, class, etc. So I wanted to just give a couple of examples about what we know about women in trauma and what we know about men in trauma. We know that for women, there's a lot of research now. Women in the system have extraordinarily high rates of trauma, upwards of 90%, which is a really staggering number, and that sexual violence is the most common among women, and then that's followed by intimate partner violence. And we know that for the women that we work in corrections, the rates of trauma they report exceed those reported by women in the general population. And importantly, their traumatic histories are often associated with increased difficulty under community supervision, in facilities, in various treatment arenas. And so I'm hoping that as we unfold today with this presentation, that you'll begin to think differently about the behaviors you're seeing displayed by the women and men you work with, and to begin to consider a possible link to trauma, and therefore set into motion some of the practices that are going to help them manage the difficulties they're experiencing as a result of the trauma that they've had in their lives. So in terms of men, it's much less likely to be acknowledged. I don't know if some of you have noticed that. If we were in person, I would poll you to get a sense of how often we're talking about men in corrections and their exposure to trauma. What we find is that it's a very different pattern that we're seeing. Men are more likely to have a primary trauma of witnessing someone being killed or seriously injured. Their exposure is very high to physical assault and childhood sexual abuse. They have much higher rates of PTSD compared to men in the general population. And we know that the risk of sexual assault increases exponentially when men enter prison. So that's really, really important to keep in mind. And we know that there's an increased threat of lethal violence in male facilities. And what we find is this triggers more externalizing trauma responses, such as aggression. And so if you're working with someone, all of these factors are operative in the community as well. The exposure to more lethal violence, the externalizing response. Men are really conditioned to be strong and tough and to cope in a much different way than women are socialized. So to say I'm sad, I'm depressed, I'm hurting is not going to be common among men, and this is where we see more of the externalizing responses. So I wanted to just call those to our attention as we're moving into a discussion of trauma and its impacts, which we'll start to do now. Trying to advance my slide here. Oh, here we go. Okay, so here are the events. I like to place this list up because it just gives us a reality check on how many things can really constitute trauma. And this is by no means complete, but Peter Levine says trauma is trauma no matter what caused it. So I always like to put out there how important it is to not base any of our personal experiences or assumptions, to not use those assumptions and experiences to define what may be traumatic for someone else. It's a deeply personal assessment when someone moves through an experience. So some of us may have had a car accident and didn't feel like it was traumatizing at all. And in fact, friends or clients we work with may have had very extreme reactions, significant reactions to the same experience. So I wanted to make sure that we can view this list without judgment and see that there are so many things that constitute trauma, and we could expand this again and look at it by gender and culture and class, etc. And the other thing is that we talk about trauma as being unusual, but we're finding more and more corrections it's actually very typical. It's a usual experience to have a traumatic exposure, and this again is another reason why being trauma informed is so important. So what we'll talk about in a little bit is how this notion of universal precautions that has been promoted by SAMHSA, which suggests that we have to really assume that the individuals we're working with have had at least one traumatic experience, if not multiple. And exercising universal precautions means we will behave in a way as staff that accounts for that. And so as we move through the material today, I'll be talking about what that looks like and what it sounds like. What does it mean to account for trauma in our direct service with the men and women that we work with? And what makes trauma so destructive is this sense of trust has been really destroyed and a sense of control. And I like to call our attention to this because there are many behaviors exhibited by the men and women we work with that are their best attempt to try to get control over their immediate environment. Trauma leaves us feeling out of control, so our human response, our instinct is to try to experience a sense of stability and control. The problem is a lot of the men and women we're working with aren't necessarily trying to get that sense of control using behaviors that are acceptable, right? There's very destructive things, destructive to self, destructive to others, that are helping them feel in control and stable, but are also getting them into trouble. So to talk through this with them becomes very important. And again, if we were in person, I would ask you what do you see as some of the more complex behaviors exhibited by the clients you work with? What are those moments where you're stumped, you're not sure of what to do, or you're surprised at the way that someone you're working with is behaving and how they seem to be really sabotaging themselves? And so be thinking about those. We can't talk live about it, but be thinking about the behaviors that complicate your work that you see your colleagues struggling with. And I'll give several examples that hopefully we can all look to say, okay, there's a larger reason that this person is behaving this way, and there's perhaps more I can do to help them experience the safety and stability that's essential if they're going to be successful in the community. So that's my plug for the ultimate goals of corrections in criminal justice. Is we certainly, I heard the words in the earlier presentation about rehabilitation and recovery. We of course want to facilitate that, and we also want to facilitate public safety. So if we're not working with people in the system to develop a sense of stability and safety and motivation when they're with us, they're not going to exhibit that when they're no longer under our supervision, and now we're placing them and our communities more at risk. So the case for trauma-informed practices is a pretty significant case. It's actually going to help us achieve our most primary goals as criminal justice professionals. So the psychological effects that we're typically seeing in a lot of publications on trauma and trauma-informed care are the ones noted here, and there are others. The anxiety and depression I mentioned earlier, lower self-esteem, nightmares, restricted affect. I mean, it's a it's a pretty comprehensive list. But the case I want to make today is that there's much more to the story of trauma and its impact, and I really want to unpack the neurophysiological effects, because what we're finding is that when we attend to those and we help manage symptoms, we find that people show up to court more, they're following through on their conditions, they're more likely, for instance, I've worked in several states where staff are mentioning to me in drug courts that one of the big frustrations is when there's a refusal to do a drug test, and how to move through those minutes with an offender so that the outcome is in the best interest of both parties. And so in order to do that, in order to figure out, gee, what do we need to do to really manage some of these behaviors, to develop more comprehensive case plans, to refer to the right community supports, we have to understand the neurophysiological basis of trauma. So we'll go to that now. So as I've mentioned, I've planted several seeds at this point, that trauma lives in the body. There's the psychological component and there's a neurophysiological component that we'll talk about. And in order to understand the neurophysiology of trauma, it's very helpful to understand the human stress response and contrast that with the trauma-influenced stress response. So as I go through this, I think we all kind of learn about ourselves when we talk about stress. I mean, we all have stress in our lives. We certainly have stress as part of our work. And also be thinking about the clients that you work with, because I'm hoping that the material I present is going to give you a much clearer lens that will help you understand much more comprehensively what's going on with the clients you work with. And as we move more in the presentation, if I know what's going on and I really understand it, now I'm going to know what to do. No matter what my position as a judge, as a prosecutor, as a public defender, as a treatment provider, as a probation or parole officer, I mean, trauma-informed practice has no boundaries, which is so exciting. And I think all of you with your different backgrounds will find this material to be extremely relevant and kind of liberating. And I'm saying that word because it was told to me by a staff member recently who said, I feel like I have so many more tools now that I can access to do the work that I need to do to create safer communities and help people really recover from destructive life circumstances. So it's exciting. So let's talk first about the human stress response. And the human stress response, I always like to use the analogy of a car. And you know, we have this beautifully designed nervous system, keeps us alive and protected. It works with us every day and every minute so that we can deal with needs and stresses. So the autonomic nervous system, and I promise I won't get too much into some of these intricacies around the brain and the nervous system. I like to keep it really simple. And the best way to think about the autonomic nervous system is that it's our control center. And so it regulates our heart rate and our breath and our digestion. And the key about the autonomic nervous system, this control center, is that it operates outside of our conscious awareness. That's going to be very important to remember as we start to talk about some of the behaviors that we see exhibited by the men and women we work with. So right now, I don't have to tell my heart to beat. None of you have to tell your lungs to breathe or your stomachs to digest. It's just happening. It's outside of your consciousness, and it's making sure that you are safe and you are stable in your body. So what we also know is that the autonomic nervous system helps us respond to changing conditions in our environment. And as we all know, trauma is a huge change in the environment. So the ANS helps us really regulate and modulate in response to things that are happening around us. And it's got two main functions, the sympathetic nervous system, and I'm sure a lot of you know about this, these two branches, the sympathetic nervous system, SNS for short, and the parasympathetic, PNS for short. Are these two main functions, and the SNS helps us to mobilize, and the PNS helps us to relax. So again, using this car analogy, the sympathetic nervous system is our gas pedal, and our parasympathetic nervous system is our brakes. And so without these, we would be in trouble. There's several things we wouldn't be able to do. We wouldn't be able to stay alive, etc. So moving on to an example. So the example I like to give is, if you could all indulge me for a moment and imagine that you are walking down a beautiful hiking path and you see 20 or 30 feet in front of you this picture, well, not this picture, but this image, and it looks like a snake. So it's this twirly thing, and you can't quite make out what it is, but you're afraid it's a snake. And you can imagine what's going to happen in your body just as you imagine this. You're probably going to have your eyes widen, your heart rate's going to increase, your respiration is going to increase. And the other things that happen is that our blood actually shifts away from our digestive system and into the muscles so that we can facilitate quicker movement. The other thing that happens is our blood vessels constrict and they drain the blood away from the skin to prepare for injury. So that's why people talk about going pale when they are frightened in a situation. That's literally because the blood is being diverted away from the skin. And our pupils dilate, our eyelids retract so we can focus our eyes. So now imagine that you're feeling all of this and you're definitely nervous and you're scared, but then you realize, okay, I have to see what this is, and I have a few options. You may decide, I'm going right back to where I came from, I'm not proceeding down this path. You may decide that you want to step a little closer and maybe even throw a twig near this snake-looking object to see if it moves, to confirm if it's a snake or not. You may choose to walk around, kind of arc so that you don't get any closer. So the key with this basic human stress response is that your body prepares for crisis, but you still have access to a lot of the faculties in the brain that allow you to think and assess and evaluate and decide. It's a really important distinction. And then let's imagine you realize after you throw this twig near this object that it does not move, and you step a little closer and you realize it's clearer with your eyes, this is just a stick. What happens is the parasympathetic nervous system kicks in, those are the brakes, and you have this huge release, right? Some of you may think of times in your life where you have this, oh, okay, thank goodness. Maybe you almost got in a car accident. Maybe you thought a loved one was going to trip and get hurt. And what happens is there's a release of the muscle tension, the heart rate comes down, the blood pressure lowers, your skin warms up, pinks up, your digestion comes back online, your breath deepens and slows, and this all happens again. This happens for you. You don't say, okay, breath, do this, okay, digestion, come online. The PNS does that for you. The brakes come online, and then your immune system also functions in the way that it was prior to the crisis. Some really important example. So the thing to keep in mind is that you have this, we all have this amazing system that we've been equipped with that allows us to drive. It allows us to use the gas and the brakes together in a balanced way so that we can get to where we need to be. And so the graph here on the right is one of my favorite graphs because it shows us that a healthy nervous system isn't a nervous system that's a flat line. It's able to get activated and then settle in this within these limits where it's not too activated and not so settled and relaxed that you're basically sleeping and immobile, right? So there's this beautiful ebb and flow of the nervous system when it hasn't been affected by trauma. It's rhythmic, it's balanced, and you can actually feel it. If we had time together live, we would sit together and talk about the times in our life when we have felt that. And I would encourage you now to be thinking about when you're at work, think of a time at work when you have felt like, wow, like this, I'm really on my A game today, even though it's, you know, on a Friday and I was able to work effectively with this colleague, or I kept my cool with this particular client who really was triggering for me. So we feel that balance, that ability to receive stress in the environment and to cope with it. So now trauma happens. And the thing to keep in mind with trauma is that it disorganizes this whole process. It's the most important thing to keep in mind. So this ebb and flow, this ability to stay in balance and in rhythm, and to use the brakes and the gas in concert together is in some cases destroyed temporarily or severely debilitated. So I love this quote by Peter Levine, who, just for your information, is an international trauma expert. He talks about how a healthy nervous system, when confronted with a stimulus or a stressor, goes into this state of imbalance and then reorders at a higher level of integration, meaning we actually our nervous systems get stronger when we're able to face a stress and overcome it. When there's been trauma, which is most of the clients we work with, this ability has been lost, and the ability to adapt to the normal stressors is really compromised. So this trauma-influenced stress response there's so much to share about it as it relates to the brain. I promise I won't get too much into it. The key is that there's an overwhelming situation, and it really stimulates what many of us are familiar with, this fight, flight, freeze. Those words are always spoken about together in relation to trauma, but really that's what happens. In a trauma-influenced stress response, we get into fight, flight, or freeze, but we're not always able to get out of it. It's very difficult to have that break situation where the parasympathetic comes online. The person is so overwhelmed that they're constantly scanning for danger, and the system never has a chance to really settle. And what I want to mention about that as it relates to the work that we're doing in drug courts is if our clients are in a state of high agitation or in a state of a depressed physiological state where there's not enough energy in the system to do what they need to do, if they're on either of those two poles, they can't complete the tasks we're hoping they're going to complete. It's difficult to set goals. their energy is otherwise occupied. So when they give us a smart remark in the courtroom like, I'm not telling you this, or I don't have to take a urine, all these different things that we see and we experience, they're in a different nervous system functioning plane, and it makes it very difficult for them to engage in the tasks that are essential for them. Okay, so what we'll talk about later is, well, how can we help them get to that place? But I just want to make this point now, that they're not there, and they're in some type of a fight, flight, or freeze, and that's going to impact their ability to pursue goals, to even set goals. And what's happening, what we're realizing in the research is that the breaks, that parasympathetic kind of, the muscles release, we calm down, we're relieved that something has passed as a stressor. There's so much important mental learning that happens at that point of relaxation in the body that our clients aren't getting. So if they're constantly agitated, Peter Levine talks about that when we have the parasympathetic nervous system kicks in, helps us to have calm, that's when we're at our most thoughtful, right? It's when we have new awareness about ourselves. We may have an aha about something that we've been struggling with. And again, if we aren't helping our clients to be in that place of nervous system functioning, they can't have those mental processes unfold that really give them insights into their lives and what they need to do. So the example I like to give here, going to this next PowerPoint, is that for our clients, everything is a snake in the sand. And we have to imagine that because trauma has disorganized how the system responds to stressors, and it could be mild stressors or major stressors. I mean, I'm sure, again, if we were all having a conversation, you'd all have examples like, I don't know, this woman on my caseload was doing beautifully, and one thing happened at her job and she quit. Or all of a sudden, she's not showing up, or he flew off the handle when I asked just one question. Or maybe there's a client that is just completely disengaged. So there are all these things that look like maladaptive, antisocial, problematic, resisting behaviors, when in fact so many of them are linked to that person's inability to get to a place where they feel calm and stable enough to truly hear what we have to say and to truly explore their lives and the goals that should be part of a drug court experience. And so again, they are experiencing everything as a threat. So this is another way of saying they're doing their best to survive. So Robert Scare, another international trauma expert, talks about how survival is the ability to avert or live through a threatening event and remember what was learned so that similar situations can be avoided in the future. And I think this is a critical definition for those of us that work in corrections and behavioral health, because what we're seeing is that the behaviors that we really characterize as negative and dysfunctional are actually their best attempts to cope. And if anything, if someone was, I don't know, hit by a car and had a really hard time being in cars, that makes a whole lot of sense, right? They remembered they lived through it. They remembered that cars can be really scary and dangerous. At least that's what experience has taught them. Now they don't want to be in cars. And we realize this even with simple things, like if we're cooking and we go near a flame, we pull our arm back really quickly. And we realize, all of us, we teach our children and everything about how to keep our bodies safe because we've learned what can happen. And I just want you to be thinking about what is it that the men and women you work with have learned from their life experience about human beings, their ability to trust, about the safety of sharing information that's personal. The extreme example of someone who's been raped multiple times, it's going to have a very difficult time connecting with individuals in a lot of cases and sharing parts of her or his life. And there will be a memory of that lives in the body that until she has a chance to really experience stability could resurface at any time. And we say any time, it could be a smell that's similar to a smell that was in the environment at the time of the rape. It could be a color. Someone that looked like the assailant walks in the room and all of a sudden she starts to literally experience the same neurophysiological reaction that she did at the time of the rape. And it's the body's way of keeping us safe. So there are two pathways of fear. On top of all of this, we have this amazing evolution designed it so that we could respond to stress and threat in the ways that I've described. But there are also two pathways of fear. Again, these will be really important for us as corrections and behavioral health professionals. There's something called the low road, which is a very fast pathway, and then the high road is a slower pathway. And here's the main difference between the two. So in my example of us hiking through the woods, seeing something that may be a threat, and feeling the neurophysiological change, the heart rate increase, etc., but still being able to think about what to do, that's the high road pathway to fear. And that high road, all of the beautiful gifts of our brains and our ability to analyze what makes us uniquely human, all of those pathways are available to us when we have the high road pathway stimulated. The low road pathway is stimulated, but it's a very different scenario. In that scenario, we have much less access to the parts of the brain that allow us to be thoughtful. And you might be thinking, well, why on earth would evolution do that? Why would it literally have the parts of the brain we need the most at that moment of fear and threat? Why would those parts of the brain be less accessible? And I have a picture that demonstrates why evolution designed that. So this is an example of why we need the low road. We need the low road because we, in our lives, will be faced with situations that require immediate responses. And to think, as is the case with this person near the shark, if this person stopped to think and weigh his options, he would die. He would likely be attacked and killed by this creature. So the low road is essential because it allows us to instantly react when we're faced with a threat. The key with our work in corrections and in behavioral health is that the individuals that we work with day to day are often experiencing reactions that are a low road reaction. This low road pathway dominates. It can be easily triggered, and it adds a very significant layer to what we're defining as this trauma-influenced stress response, the stress response that involves much less balance, much more disorganization in the system. And so it's really important to keep in mind that these instant reactions we often associate with a lot more intention that's just simply not there. It's an immediate response, whether it be an offender cussing you out, swearing at you, threatening you, disengaging from you. We're realizing with the research on trauma that that's an instant reaction that's often governed by these low road pathways to fear. And the one brain anatomy term I'll use is the amygdala. That's our fear center. It's actually the first part of the brain that develops in utero. And the low road pathway is wired directly to the amygdala. So that tells you something, right? The amygdala is part of our reptilian brain, which is the brain that's that unconscious. It's not anything that we're telling it to do this, to do that, making active decisions. It's just happening. And the trauma that many of the folks we work with have experienced makes it very easy for them to operate along that pathway, or we talk about triggers a lot when we discuss trauma. They're easily triggered into a place of instant reaction. And what the experts are saying is that when someone with a trauma history has been triggered, it's like chemically it's the equivalent of a biological atomic bomb going off inside the body. There's instant reactions neurochemically that were present at the time of their original trauma that are set into motion just by a trigger. So if we think of what are some of the triggers in drug court, and you all have different roles, it could be how you look. It could be the spaciousness of the courtroom. It could be, as I mentioned, smells are often very big triggers. It could be how you're moving your body. It could be the placement of the judge in relation to the offender. If it's an elevated bench, and so she or he has to look up at the judge, that can be a trigger. It could be the doors opening and closing in the courtroom. We could think of several around, what's your office like? What's the building like? What's the space like? What's the privacy level? What are the noises that are normal in your environment as you're delivering services as a parole officer, a treatment provider? There are several triggers that are part of our corrections practice, and I never say to folks that means we need to stop. What it means is there's a way, again, to prepare the women and men we're working with to to deal with those triggers, to get ahead of it almost. And we'll talk about that very concretely in a little bit. So if we know there's going to be a certain process as part of court proceeding, we might want to talk to her about that and see if she has any concerns about that and any supports we might offer when she goes to court. And we can do the same thing with any drug court process, treatment process, going into the community, job interviews. There are lots of things that the men and women we work with can do to prepare themselves for these triggers and therefore move through them much more successfully. And so this graph, if you recall the one I had up earlier, that had that kind of that curve that showed the activation and the settling. This one I like to show because it shows in a very visual way how a traumatic event interrupts that and triggers as well, as we just talked about. Triggers are very different for each person as well, but they really they remind us of the trauma. And in this graph, they talk about how individuals who have been triggered could be stuck on high or stuck on low, meaning they're stuck on that gas pedal, that mobilization, the increased heart rate, respiration, hyperactivity, hypervigilance, all of that, or they're stuck on low. And I think we forget to talk about being stuck on low. And that, again, it's basically when it's only the brakes. There's this real depressed response to avoid the environment and the fears in that environment. So that's where we have our men or women clients who are completely disconnected from what we're talking about. There's fatigue, there's this lack of motivation, there's almost a numbness. A lot of the men and women I've worked with, they talk about not even feeling fully present. So this is, again, a form of survival mode. And I like to talk about it, how it operates from the top to the bottom. It's from the brain all the way into the body and from the bottom up. And again, we have several things that we do in corrections that we may not realize are triggering the men and women we're working with. And so what we're going to move to very soon is to talk about how to alter some of the procedures that we have to move through to make them more trauma-informed. Because if we do that, we're going to create regulation, not only psychological safety, but safety in the body that opens up that person's ability to be present, engaged, motivated, thoughtful, etc. Complex trauma, this is just an aside. This could be a whole other training, but I did want to mention that there are clients that we will work with that have something called complex trauma, and the distinction there is that complex trauma occurs when there's traumatic exposure very early in life, and it's usually involving primary caregivers, people that are trusted and loved, who are emotionally and abusive, etc. And so it creates a foundation for how that person functions that it really can contribute to a lot of the problem behaviors that we see once they're with us. So I just wanted to encourage you to research complex trauma. We don't have much time to talk about it today, or call or email me. I have great articles on that by scholars in the field. It's just we're realizing more and more that we've talked about sexual assault, physical abuse, a variety of traumatic exposures, and we're not asking enough about complex trauma, even in our assessments, and it's really important to be aware of when that's in play. So I talked about this. So now let's move into the physiological and physical effects. So a lot of these things that you see here, pain, nausea, vomiting, panic attacks, insomnia, a lot of these things we tend to look at separately from the psychological ones I had up earlier that are around anxiety and depression, etc. And what we have to see is that in many cases these are inextricably linked. And so you might say, okay, well, if I know that a trauma survivor, let's say a particular woman that you're working with, you could tell is very hypervigilant, looks uncomfortable in your office, seems agitated physically and psychologically, that's an indication that she may be stuck on high. That hypervigilance, that mobilization as part of the nervous system that is preparing her for a problem. And life has taught her there are problems, so I have to be prepared. And so if our bodies are revved up like that chronically, or you might say it's happening multiple times a week for her, are we surprised that she ends up with headaches? Or that if we know that digestion literally goes offline in the face of a threat, So are we surprised that she has digestive issues? What we're seeing now is that this chronic hypervigilance or this chronic depressed physiological state has physical repercussions that we're finally beginning to see more holistically. And those of you who are familiar with the ACE study is one of the most amazingly important examples of what the ultimate long-term impact is for survivors who never have a chance to fully recover from what has happened to them and who are stuck on high or stuck on low. What we're seeing through the ACE study is that it takes a significant physical toll. So just a quick summary for folks who may not be familiar with the ACE study. It stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences, and it was one of the largest investigations ever conducted, assessing the association between maltreatment in childhood and later physical and behavioral health. And the CDC and Kaiser Permanente partnered, and the amazing thing is 17,000 HMO members participated in this study, and there's been over 100 journal articles at conferences. It's known around the world, this study. If you haven't read up on it, I strongly suggest that you do. What the findings of the ACE study include basically demonstrates that adverse childhood experiences, and this is sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, family disorganization, those constitute adverse childhood experiences. They looked at 10. The more of those, and they call them ACEs for short, the more ACEs someone had, the more likely they were to experience a variety of illnesses, early death, poor quality of life, a range of adverse behavioral health outcomes, things like heart disease, more likely to use substances, more likely to attempt suicide. So this pyramid here shows that there's this link between early traumatic experiences and later physical, emotional, and behavioral health. And there's some really important studies now happening in corrections, in the criminal justice arena, in psychiatry, in psychology with various populations and community mental health, where they're actually trying to replicate the ACE study with their population. I'm encouraging states to do this because they're finding that now when we're talking, remember the 17,000 who participated in the ACE study were from the general population. And we've already talked about how trauma tends to be much higher in the criminal justice and behavioral health populations. So what we're finding is what we would expect, that the outcomes are even worse. The other interesting thing we're doing in different states are starting to do studies of how staff are dealing with their own past traumas and reporting it confidentially, of course, the number of ACEs staff have had in their lives and how it may be impacting their current quality of life. And that makes the case for a whole other training on staff self-care, right? If we had more time together, we would talk about that and even, again, the trauma of doing this work. So the ACE study is particularly important, shows this long-term impact. So now we're moving into the, what's probably flashing in your minds is, okay, we get it, now what? What do we do with this? So if we've talked about the neurophysiology of trauma and how trauma changes the brain and the nervous system, I'm excited to share with you this neurophysiology of resilience and the research that's showing that how we structure our different spaces in corrections and behavioral health, how we relate to survivors can actually facilitate healing at the brain-body level. And what I mean by that is we actually can change the brains of the individuals we're working with, including our colleagues. We can actually impact their nervous system functioning in the moment if we are practicing trauma-informed care. So it's very, very exciting, this next piece that we're going to talk about. And just be thinking about how there are certain things in corrections and in behavioral health that cannot change anytime soon. When I work with institutions, they talk about things like searches and cell extractions. On the community side, we hear a lot about the requirements around home visits and urinalysis, drug testings of all kind, and we're realizing it's not that we are ever recommending that we cannot do the work of corrections, but the way we do that work can actually be enhanced so that we're creating more stability, opening up a situation in which our clients can feel more motivated and able to move in their environment effectively, be it setting goals, parenting, working, getting educated in a way that they've set a goal to, etc. So these are really two critical, important areas of research. And we're also realizing that the research now on how we relate to those we work with is showing that our rapport makes a huge difference, sometimes even more of a difference than the models that we've created. So if we think about, we could have what we would perceive as the most amazing trauma-informed group curriculum with a beautiful manual, shiny cover, lots of materials. But if the person delivering that is not trauma-informed, that curriculum will not have an impact. Moreover, if the curriculum is delivered in a very effective way, in conjunction with a great risk need assessment that's gender responsive and trauma-informed and culturally competent, if that client then steps into a courtroom where they feel frightened and disrespected, it will actually undermine those other two components. So that gets back to my introductory comments about everything that we're doing has to hang together and be trauma-informed. And too often I see that folks are saying, well, we're trauma-informed because we have this great trauma group, or we're trauma-informed because we have a trauma screen. And those things are absolutely important. They're just not enough. And we're not going to, and I think of the PowerPoints you had up earlier, all these amazing things that you're doing will go so much further if we're doing them in a trauma-informed way and collaborating the multidisciplinary piece that you covered in the first 30 minutes. I was very impressed with this interaction between judges and prosecutors, defense counsel, POs, mental health professionals. I mean, it's fabulous. So now how are those teams functioning so that they're supporting a trauma-informed approach between them and then directed toward the client? So let's talk about some of this a little bit more in terms of this, what can we do? So the three main categories that I wanted to focus on, given that we have a fairly short amount of time together, is the first I mentioned, this first thing we can always do is this universal precautions piece, which is assuming trauma is present, don't assume that it's not, and respond accordingly. And that responding accordingly leads to these second bullets. Create regulation, meaning safety and stability, and resiliency, meaning a motivation to be active in one's environment and to assert themselves in terms of goal setting, meeting conditions of court, etc. And we're going to define those even more in a moment. And then practice trauma-informed care at all levels. And I have some 8 steps towards becoming trauma-informed that I'll review. So these are the main 3 kind of things that I want us to be thinking about as we talk about this what next piece. So let's look at each one. So when we talk about creating regulation and resilience, this is directly from the brain research and the research on trauma that's, again, as I hope that I've made clear on what happens now when trauma has disorganized the system. There's dysregulation, there's lack of balance. So and we want to create a situation where our clients are having an experience that's more balanced and regulated, and that means they're able to tolerate difficult thoughts, feelings, and sensations, including those caused by triggers. They're able to connect not only with themselves but with others effectively and engage in effective action. So if I just pause there for a minute, if you just look at those 3, I mean, that would be huge, right? I mean, if the person in front of us, regardless of our role as a judge or a PO or a treatment provider, is able to do those 3 things, we are really providing the support that they need to move forward. That's really difficult to do, right? Because it's not often, I know in my direct service experience, when I was working, for instance, my first 6 jobs was with a drug court, and I was working with adolescent girls, and it's not that they were coming in to receive services from me and saying, I just want to let you know, Alyssa, that I'm feeling very triggered today, and I'd love to do some journaling so I can regulate my system. I mean, that's not where they were starting, right? They were in a much different pattern of coping with their experience. So we have to create cues in the environment that give them a chance to create a new pattern. And that might mean how we structure our space, what we have on our walls. I always had in my office, even though it wasn't technically necessary, I always had, in addition to my chair, 2 or 3 others, so that when a client walked in the room, I could say, where would you prefer to sit? So that would provide her with some respect and choice and healthy power so that she could choose. I didn't have to do that, but it was one of those things that I intentionally built into the space to help cue her nervous system to stability. if I have her walk in and say, you need to sit down and not bug me and not answer my questions and be difficult like you were last week, that's going to actually cause a whole different response in her nervous system, the tension and everything I described earlier. So there are things that are small like that are very significant in terms of how we structure our environment. Then in terms of resiliency on the right here, when someone's resilient, they're able to access and utilize skills and strengths, which the research on strengths-based practice is really showing that it's transforming. It's definitely transforming clinical work, and it's transforming a lot of corrections jurisdictions that are employing strengths-based approaches. It's transforming how people are moving through corrections processes, be it courtrooms, probation, etc., even in prisons and other institutions. So they can utilize skills and strengths. They can cope with the day-to-day stresses and burdens. Remember, we talked about earlier, that ability has either been lost, or depending on the trigger, they can lose it in an instant if the trigger resembles their original traumatic event or events. So we're able to cope, but then they're also able to explore solutions to problems and set and achieve goals. So if we look at this column, this is really where we're moving forward with exciting and important work with the men and women on our caseloads. This is where we want them to be. We want to help them to get to this point, and there are so many interruptions to this that are caused mostly by not certainly by the lack of components. That you all have these this multimodal approach to the drug courts in Maine. That's what I learned from your first 30 minutes. So not every state has that. Not every state is as thoughtful as what you're doing. So that's the first part of the equation. What do we have in place? But then again, what are those things doing in terms of supporting this regulation and resiliency? Again, from a court proceeding to a urinalysis to a case management meeting. So these are the definitions to keep in mind as we're talking about what next. So I'd like to just give a quick example. So on the right here, there are behaviors over the course of my work in the field. It could be during a group, someone says this is stupid and I'm leaving. Or let's say a PO or a CO starts a risk need assessment and the client says, I'm not telling you anything. Or the other example, someone refuses a drug test, as I mentioned earlier, and as the staff react and tell her she's got to do it, she becomes more agitated and aggressive. So these are the behaviors that, and there are several more, that we deal with day to day, and typically we look at them at a very surface level, and we have a lot of fancy ways to manage these behaviors, when in fact there are trauma-informed practices that we can employ before these things happen, but also despite our best efforts to create a trauma-informed environment, she still may be triggered. She may still get upset, in which case we want to be able to have trauma-informed responses. So if you're thinking about this first one, this group is stupid, I'm leaving, there are lots of things that we can say that are going to create more of a problem and a power struggle in that situation. Like, well, you need to stay here. That's, this group is required and you need to go. Or let's say she's working with you as a case manager or treatment provider, and you have now found out after the fact that she left group, and she says to you, I'm not going back there, it's stupid. So how we respond then, and what we'll talk about a little bit, is there's a way to open the dialogue to get more information in a non-judgmental manner that lets you know, I hear you and I get it, this is tough for you. And then once you have that piece in place, that rapport, you're able to talk about what the requirements are. Often she's ready before we are even to talk about that, the fact that although she left, she knows it's required and now she's in violation. So I'll talk more about that in a minute, but I just want us to look at these. And before we talk about effective responses, let's consider what the potential triggers are. So in this example about the group being stupid, it may have nothing to do with the group. She may be saying that because there's been an environmental trigger where there's a hallway door that's open, that's usually closed, and that's scary to her. She's wondering, and again, this may not be happening at a conscious level. There's this sense of there's an open door, who or what is going to come through that, am I safe? She doesn't say, gee, I'm triggered right now. She just says group is stupid. Sometimes, and I've dealt with this a lot as well, sometimes the groups that we're sending men and women to are excellent, and sometimes they're not so great. Sometimes there's a lack of trauma-informed care happening at the group level, either because of facilitation or because the other members of the group are creating a scary situation or a triggering situation for our client. Eyes rolling, being forced to disclose, being criticized for not sharing certain information in a group. All of that can be happening, and she may give us nothing other than that group is stupid. So to just give a consequence at that point doesn't provide her with any opportunity to do what we talked about earlier, which is, let me see if I can do this the right way, which is to tolerate this difficulty of not liking the group, connect with you about it, and then if you move her to the right, she's going to utilize her skills and her talents to actually explore solutions. If we don't provide that opportunity in our words and our connection with her or him to create regulation, there's no way she's going to move towards resiliency, and the consequence is just going to infuriate her. So it's really important to be thinking about how there's always one of my favorite statements is every external behavior reflects an internal psychological and physiological state. There's always something driving what she or he is saying or doing, and we have to try to be detectives, very quick thinking detectives, to figure that out. And often if we just say, tell me what's going on with the group, instead of you're in violation, they feel more respected. They open up to what's really going on, then we can problem solve with them. And that's the skill they need to make it in the community and not come back into the system. They need to know how to problem solve. And a lot of the times we're solving problems for them and administering consequences. It's not that consequences aren't relevant, but they always should be paired with a supportive function that helps this person be more thoughtful about, why did I get so mad? So in this assessment example, she says, I'm not telling you anything. Well, if we brainstorm really quickly, why would someone we're interviewing not want to tell us anything? Embarrassed, fearful, scared. I've heard from men and women, they feel like they're selling out their friends and family if they're going to be completely honest about some difficulty they experience. It feels disloyal to them. So instead of, well, you need to answer these questions, it's really important, we might say, well, what's difficult about this process for you? Like when you know we have an assessment to complete, what is it like to even hear me say that? And I promise you, 9 times out of 10, they will tell you, well, it feels really personal. Now you have something to work with. I'm so glad you told me it feels personal to you. How can we make this process feel a little safer, knowing that we have to complete it? So it opens up a much more thoughtful dialogue that actually impacts motivation, but also they're more likely to show up. And you're not going to see this recidivism at different levels in the system. Well, the last example I just want to mention quickly, she refuses her drug test. We start to react. Why might someone refuse a drug test? If we know what's involved with submitting, for instance, a urine, it's extremely invasive. It's something that we have to do. It's part of our jobs, but there are, especially when it comes to physical and sexual abuse, the association with the body is very negative. There's a lot of shame. There's a lot of embarrassment. I think any one of us would be embarrassed if we had to submit a urine in someone's presence or in close proximity. What we find is that women and men are triggered by this physiologically. So literally the muscle tension that I talked about earlier, in the face of a threat, there's a tensing of the muscles. That includes the bladder. And I've had women say to me, my bladder is shy, my bladder is shy, I can't get it out. And that's often because there's a tension and a fear in the body. So that circles us back to how important it is to see trauma and its impacts beyond not just the psychological, but the physiological impacts. So in a situation like this, I've actually learned quite a bit by my own mistakes. I used to say in that first drug court program I ran, I used to say, well, this is as embarrassing for me as it is for you. And I learned the hard way that made my clients feel even more ashamed. They felt like I didn't have my own center, and I couldn't kind of hold a safe environment for them as they needed to complete this task. So again, what can we do right before a drug test? How does it unfold? What is your policy and procedure around that in your agency so that it can, you still have to do it, she and he have to do these requirements, but they can unfold in a way that's much more stabilizing. So I'll give you a couple of examples about that in a little bit. So going to these 8 steps. So I had those 3 bullets on a previous slide. We talked about universal precautions. We just talked about what it really means to create regulation and resilience in our interpersonal interactions rather. So these 8 steps, again, could each be unpacked in a whole day, but there are documents that I'll show you at the end. I have several resources to share with you that will provide more information on each of these, but I wanted to give you a sense of what the overview is. So the first is we, of course, want to make a commitment to trauma-informed practice, and I would add to that acknowledge how critical it is in terms of its impact on our ultimate outcomes, our intermediate and our ultimate outcomes in drug courts and in affiliated treatment programs. So we want to make that commitment. We want to acknowledge how important it is and how it really bolsters our ultimate effectiveness. We want to support and train staff. So I was honored to be asked to speak with you all today because this opportunity for us to take a break from our busy lives and really think about trauma and its impacts, and then more importantly, what do we do about it in our unique role and function. Staff need that time. I have a lot of compassion for staff who are doing the work day in and day out and not much time to do this reflection. The third one is implement trauma-informed tools and services, and what I mean by that is these assessment tools, these screens, curricula. All of these are important components, but then we also, in number 4 here, we have to adopt trauma-informed language and communications. Sometimes the terms we use, and the extreme examples are in prisons, where we talk about cell blocks and shakedowns. I was in a state recently, they talk about when they're talking with an inmate that where staff have to put hands on and do an escort, they say, you lug them, you go lug them. So a lot of the terms we use actually are very traumatizing. We don't realize that, and it impacts how someone experiences that moment in several minutes, if not hours or days after that. So can we use different terms? And the trauma-informed language I'll talk about in a little bit, literally how we have a conversation can create stability in that regulation and resilience. I talked a little bit already about creating trauma-informed spaces, and I would just encourage you again to think about any space that our clients pass through, hallways, courtrooms. The way you structure that creates regulation or not. I would encourage you to take a look at the Florida Drug Court. They are taking this very seriously, this notion of being trauma-informed. The judge is, Judge Farnell is doing some extremely groundbreaking work in terms of how her courtroom looks and how she moves within the courtroom. So she often will talk with offenders. She comes down from the bench and talks with them to create a mutuality space that doesn't position her as the authority figure over the offenders. That's how she has taken some of this material. I'm not saying you all have to do that, but it's interesting to look at what some of the creative things are that are happening and how it's impacting offenders and their ability to even, for instance, stay in the courtroom and engage with us in the ways that we need them to. Revise existing procedures to be more trauma-informed. So take what we have and try to make it trauma-informed, but also try to introduce any new procedures or practices that intentionally create regulation and resilience. So in this Florida Drug Court, they have displays on the wall of success. So instead of just do's and don'ts, people get to celebrate their success, so women and men come into this drug court and get to look around and see positive references to behaviors that they might appeal to. And there's a group, there's a wall devoted to even health and well-being, where people get to put on that wall what they're doing to protect their health and well-being. And that's that strengths-based approach that creates stability for people. And implement strategies to help men and women manage difficult trauma symptoms. And this is where I think the groups are very popular in corrections, understandably, because there are groups that I'll share with you later that are specifically designed to do this. I think we have to do a better job of creating environments in general outside of group that also help offenders manage difficult trauma symptoms. And I think the best behavior management technique is our tone and content when we talk with women and men at any point in the process, be it during an assessment, court visit, home visit, a check-in, phone call. So I'm going to review quickly a model called CR2 that's specifically designed to give us the skills we need to have those conversations, be it just a regular conversation about how she's doing or how he's doing, or a conversation that has to happen that's about administering a consequence, that's about holding the offender accountable for a violation of a rule. So it's a skill set that you can use pretty much at any time. That's specifically trauma informed and designed to create regulation and resilience, and build a safe trauma informed environment. Introducing the strategies I'll talk about in a little bit. We basically want the whole environment of the drug court, every component, to be infused with trauma informed principles. And the principles are these 5 here. It's my favorite list. There's lots of, again, I've mentioned earlier, there's a lot being written about trauma-informed care, but the documents I prefer are the ones that really unpack it and don't just talk about theoretically what needs to happen, but practically, what do we do? So in these principles, we want to create in every interaction, at any point in our drug court processes, safety, trust, choice, collaboration, and empowerment. These are very difficult things to bring to life in corrections, and especially corrections, also behavioral health settings. If you're a one-on-one clinician in the general population seeing clients individually, it's a lot easier to do these things. If you're in a group home, it's a lot easier to do these things. But when we get involved in corrections and requirements and mandates, it's really hard, because part of that requires that we are the ones making choices. So we have to try to build in these things so that the clients we work with can experience them as well. And let's skip this. A helpful way to think about this is to look at, on the left here, we have these 5 principles, but on the right, what are the various things that are part of the work that we do? Court appearances, assessments, drug screening, various interpersonal reactions, programming, medical and mental health services. I'm sure you could fill in more based on your unique setting, but we want to be thinking about how can I bring these 5 principles to life as part of each of these things. So take a home visit. How are you going to make sure that that creates a sense of safety, trust, choice, collaboration, and empowerment? And that's the example I gave of the chairs in my office is a way to do a lot of those at once. You're building certainly choice. There's a collaborative tone because I'm inviting the client to make a selection and to talk with me about that. There's the empowerment experience of being able to exercise choice. That leads to them feeling safe and that it's a trustworthy interaction. So there's one thing you can do in each of these that can probably meet all of the principles of trauma-informed care. And I encourage you to be thinking about that. And I know we'll leave some time for questions, and feel free to ask about some of these things and how you may be more trauma-informed. I mean, some of the assessments, for instance, assessments can be extremely triggering, regardless of whether or not they have good content. The way we go about them, when we ask more personal questions, are we evaluating how she or he is responding in a need for a break or a glass of water? Are we acknowledging these questions may be difficult, how are you doing? That's a way to make an assessment more trauma-informed. And so you can certainly ask questions about ways to do that, and there are a few documents that give a great checklist about these things and how to make them more trauma-informed. So the things we need to be paying attention to is safety and stability in our interactions, as I mentioned, cueing, making sure that our environment is cueing those 5 principles. You know, what are we doing in the environment that creates opportunities for empowerment and choice, etc. And are we really being thoughtful about potential triggers in the environment and either eliminating them or, if not possible, creating processes that allow our clients to move through those required procedures with a little less dysregulation. So I have an example that I'd like to share with you about a trauma-informed procedure. So I like to share this because you can use this with virtually any process, any drug court process, treatment program, prisons. There's pretty much broad applicability of this, and I'll go through it and give you an example of how to abbreviate it. So with pretty much everything we're doing, whether it's your initial meeting, whether it's a court proceeding, any of those things that on the previous slide that we have to engage in, you want to share with her or him what's going to happen and why. So we're going to do a drug test, this is why. I'd like to complete an assessment, this is why. I need to go through your belongings, this is why. So you just give that rationale and you just describe briefly what it entails. and offer choices where you can. Would you be more comfortable if I put your bag here or there? Would you be more comfortable doing the assessment without a break or with a break? Would you like water while we do this? You want to reassure them that you're going to conduct it in a way that maximizes comfort, and not prepare them either way that it's going to be good or bad. Just to say, I'm going to do this in a way that's as comfortable as possible. Do you have any suggestions on how we might do this so that it's as comfortable for you? Do you want to share that with me now? And so I have found that sometimes a client will give very clear ideas. Well, please do this or please don't do that. And we can either accommodate those requests or not. And it's important to use that phrasing. I'll accommodate whatever I can. I can't make promises, but I do want to ask. What I have found in practice is that when we've done implementation in different states on trauma-informed practices, just the act of asking a client, do they have something that they need to share with us, is regulating in and of itself. And that's the feedback we're getting. We're doing this in a lot of different states, and they're finding that even in prisons, offenders are saying, I don't know what you just did, but it made me really feel comfortable. And it's changing the tone of that interaction and making an otherwise really uncomfortable procedure more comfortable. And then you can conduct it, obviously, once you move into what you have to do, you keep trauma in mind, and you can use verbal cues along the way. You're doing a really good job. Thank you so much. Now I'm going to do this if it involves invasion of personal space. And then when it's done, and this may seem silly, but you really want to let them know that you're done. For instance, if you are going through belongings or you have completed the assessment, you can say, so we just finished the assessment. Because there's, again, if you think back to why I dragged us through all that neurophysiology, there can be that instability in the system that makes the client fearful, and just the act of saying we did this and you did a great job brings the system down. And you can check in, see how they're doing, thank them, and let them know what's next. Now, you may be looking at this saying, yeah, right, like there's no way I have time to do that. So what I always say to folks is pick one or two, and they actually will go a lot farther than you realize. Thanking someone always is received pretty well. Even if they don't seem happy that you said thank you, I can guarantee you from my hundreds of focus groups across the country with offenders, they appreciate it. They may not want to show you that they appreciate it, but they appreciate it, and they notice it. And what it does is, instead of triggering them and making them angry at you, and now they're focused on how to get you back, they feel comfortable, and their focus is on them, which is what we want. Even if all you have a chance to do is say, I really am going to make this as comfortable as possible. I'm mindful that these things may not be easy. Let me know if you need anything. So in those examples, it's under 5 seconds, and I know that we can at least do that. So be thinking about which of these you have the ability to implement when you're doing your work, if it can't be all of these steps. And so the CR2 is helpful to talk about, give an example of this in relation to let's say you have to move through, there's a case management session, and you know it's going to be difficult because the client has, there have been, either there's been a violation since your last meeting, or there's been, they've been unable to secure the job that was expected to be secured by now. So CR2 is the model I referenced earlier. It's a communication model. And I want to share with you, because the spirit of this, after this webinar, you could start to use this immediately without even seeing the model itself. It's the key with CR2, which stands for Creating Regulation Resiliency, is that it's a way of communicating at any point, when you greet, when you say goodbye, when you're doing a case management, anything, any of the things that you're doing, the way for you to communicate that creates regulation resilience. And it's having a conversation that may be minutes long, it may be a couple minutes or 20. But you have two distinct parts, and I encourage you all to try to have always these two parts of a conversation with the clients you're working with. And the first part is your goal is to create regulation, and you wanted, and the acronym is here. You're basically asking an open-ended question. So tell me what was difficult this week, or what went well this week. How did your week go? And you wait to hear the information so that you can acknowledge it without judgment. It was a really difficult week. I know I was supposed to go to my job interview. I just couldn't get there. And instead of, this is, and there she goes again, or there he goes again, So what was that like for you? I felt upset. I knew you would be upset, and now I know it's a violation. Whatever she or he says, you can acknowledge, this is really difficult for you. So you're creating that rapport. You're helping, instead of adding a power struggle and jumping right into the consequence, you want to hear them for a little bit, see what's going on. There's always a larger picture. There's always something driving the behavior, and it's often pretty complicated. So part 2 then, which again might happen a minute later, is this notion of repair. And in repair, that acronym is capturing, so now how are we going to work together to solve this? And the key with phase 2 is to not solve it for her or for him. You don't want to say, well, now this is what you need to do. Instead, you want to reflect on, okay, so you had these goals, you weren't able to meet them. What can we do? So the explore here is this notion of exploring possibilities. What are some of the solutions we can pursue here? And so again, I can't go through in detail what the steps are, but I wanted to give you an example of this two-part communication where the order matters. Unless there's an immediate safety security risk, a physical threat, we really need to not be jumping into consequences, but in first starting to create some regulation in that system. And what I will tell you is that, having implemented this in various places, our clients, having experienced phase 1, actually do beautifully in phase 2. They feel connected, they feel safe, they feel like they've had some choice, they feel like we're being collaborative. So by the time there is discussion of a consequence, or be it a natural consequence or something that's part of their conditions that's going to now come into play, they're ready for it. And in fact, you can get really creative with this and say, so now that we've talked about this, and I'm so appreciative that you told me what was going on and why you couldn't get there, so do you remember what your conditions were and what needs to happen now? And they know. And what's great about that is we're not telling them what has to happen. They're telling us. They're being thoughtful. The key with this is that we often move into a very cognitive problem-solving place when there's instability in the nervous system, when there's been a trigger and when someone is really unnerved. We start to get, it's like you think of that low road and high road. Remember, this low road means there's not as much access to those thoughtful, analytical parts of the brain, yet we're going there with our clients at times where they're in a low road response. So let's bring all parts of the brain back online through our relationship and our rapport, and then we'll be able to move into the problem solving. So I hope that makes sense. You're literally helping them access their full capacity neurophysiologically so that you can have the hard conversation that is about planning and goal setting. But you can't do that if that basic regulation isn't in place. So there are a few models that I wanted to share with you, and I have a slew of resources, and I know, like Kate had mentioned, that this will be available to you online. My goal wasn't to go through these in a great amount of detail, but just to let you know that there are some really well-known interventions that are trauma-specific and based on the empowerment and other principles that I've talked about. They've been used extensively. Some have more research than others. Many are evidence-based. And I am presenting these not because I'm endorsing them, but rather because it's a great list for you to see some of the models that are out there. And there's a web link that I've provided that will allow you to look at any one of these and the summary of this model. And some of them may be very familiar to you. So there's this list that I wanted to call your attention to. And then if you look at this first bullet, SAMHSA's National Center for Trauma-Informed Care is an excellent resource. The link below it is the one that gives a summary of each of those models. Then the National Resource Center on Justice Involved Women that I'm a part of also has a variety of resources. Two in particular I'll share with you on the next PowerPoint. But there's a variety of resources there that are about, there's a whole lot on women specifically, but much of what we're writing and the technical assistance we're providing through that resource center is applicable to men as well. And of course, many of you have probably heard of the National Institute of Corrections. That's another great resource on trauma. You should be aware that NIC is doing a lot of work on what they call correction stress, secondary trauma for professionals working with the clients, and I think that work is critical. The two documents I wanted to call your attention to from the Resource Center, and the link is provided on the PowerPoint. There's one that's about trauma-informed practices. It goes through those 8 steps in a little bit more detail and gives some examples. So that's the one on the right. And although it's about facilities, it's very applicable, pretty much all of it, to community corrections and behavioral health. And then the Discipline and Sanctions Policy Guide, I wanted to draw your attention to that because, again, even though it's about facilities, a lot of we do a review of behavior management, and there's a specific look at considerations for women, and there's a really extensive lit review at the end of that you might find helpful just to get more steeped in some of the gender responsive considerations. And again, it's a specific look at behavior management with the principles are very applicable to behavioral health and community corrections. And some useful documents I've provided. There's one on reentry. On page 22 of this document from the Center for Effective Public Policy, there's actually a list of additional programs, including Moving On from Orbis Partners, some programs by Stephanie Covington. There are others there that also are summarized in terms of what they provide and some of the research. And then there's an excellent publication, Models for Developing Trauma-Informed Behavioral Health Systems, with a link that just is it's an excellent state of the field on what some of the models are around trauma-informed practice. So I wanted to draw your attention to that as well. And as we conclude, I wanted to just wrap up by saying, you know, here on the left we have the trauma, okay, be it one event or multiple events has led to someone having a traumatized nervous system. And you see all the words around that, and we could put many more around what that person is experiencing. And it's like many are referring to this as deep sensory distress. They're coming to us in this state, not necessarily conscious of it, and resorting to behaviors to feel more safe and stable that are getting them into further trouble. We all know the link between trauma, mental health, and substance use. So that's just one example, but there's several. And then on the right here, though, if we really need to consider that this ecology of trauma is the message about this push to look at the environment in trauma-informed care. The message is everything we do can actually make those symptoms worse and create more distress or create the stability that that person needs. So if you look at this ecological model on the right, the people that we are working with, the clients, the offenders, are situated within a much larger context, and we are part of that. We are the personal and the community. And what I love about this chart is the dotted lines that shows there's some fluidity there, and that we are providing perhaps their first experience of empowerment and choice and safety, and that is extremely important if we want to do the ultimate job of corrections and behavioral health. And so the last one here that I wanted to end with on a very hopeful note is that the research, as I mentioned, on trauma is showing that healing is not only possible, but it's changing how we provide services in behavioral health and corrections. And we now realize that people have an innate capacity to heal, and that we can build new pathways literally in the brain just by how we speak to someone. And the biggest outcome is that the relationship and rapport that we're creating as part of the work we do with offenders, and the quality of that relationship profoundly impacts outcomes, whether they'll show up, how they are when they are with us, and what they're going to even be experiencing when they leave our offices and our programs. So this motivation and healing happens within the context of those relationships, and it's really, really essential that we see how important we are. And the quote I'd like to end with is from Louis Cozolino, who talks about interpersonal neurobiology, how we're wiring and firing together with our brains when we're in someone else's presence. So that power of being with somebody else is literally shaping our neurophysiology. So see yourselves as agents of transformation. In the moment, in the simplest of moments, you can transform how someone is functioning in their own neurophysiology, but just by how you talk with them. So I know we only have a couple of minutes, but Kate, did you want to open it up for a couple of questions?
So I think we have unmuted folks at this point. So if there are any questions, you know, please go ahead, or you can type, I guess, in the chat box.
L. a nuestra agencia. Pues mañana a las 10 te vas a reunir conmigo y con mi colega Matt.
Alyssa, I guess we
Yes.
Go ahead.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I was just going to say that we covered really a whole lot of information. Each one of it could be a topic in itself. So I just, as folks are digesting the material, if there is, in the days and weeks and months ahead, if there's ever a question or a resource that you're interested in getting more information about, please don't hesitate to call or email. And I don't think I think I neglected to put my email on here, but it's Core Associates LLC at Comcast.net. And I'd be happy to chat with you, hear about what's going well, hear about your successes. So it's kind of on the spot now to ask questions, but I'm available at any point to talk about this. It's an exciting topic.
And it's such an important topic. So I think that it's something that, as you have said, Alyssa, that we just need to pay attention to in all of our interactions on kind of on a daily basis, and is really important in terms of helping people engage with the drug court, stay engaged, and benefit from the services. And I know that I've seen some of these resources that you've shared, and they are very good. So thank you.
And could I mention quickly too, Kate, that and I could talk more about this on the phone or via email, but I do want to just plant the seed that as agencies are making decisions about evidence-based practices, just be aware that some of what we consider evidence-based is evidence-based for men, and it hasn't necessarily been based on, some of the things that we're considering best practice weren't necessarily based on research conducted on women, and there's a lot of material and resource on that, including some of the curricula that we consider to be evidence-based. So the evidence base is ever growing, and we have some fundamental learnings that are excellent, but there's a very exciting emerging evidence base for women, including new assessment tools, classification tools, group curricula, that I really encourage you to talk with me about if you're interested, so that we're not implementing evidence-based practices that are essentially practices that work primarily for men and haven't been necessarily demonstrated to work with women. So a lot of jurisdictions are tackling that, and I'd be happy to chat about that if anyone wants to make contact about it.
Okay, well, thank you, because it's hard to kind of keep up with all of this, and so it's nice to be able to know kind of what is on the new developments and what we should be looking at, especially as we start to add different types of programming into the drug courts here in Maine. I think that a wonderful offer, and I hope people take advantage of it. So we will send out the PowerPoint and send out the evaluation. And Alyssa, I can just add in probably your email address on this so that everyone has it. Okay. I just want to thank you so much for your presentation. It was a pleasure to have you. So
thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, bye-bye, everyone.